My name is Laura Valli, and I'm a PhD student at the Bread Lab at Washington State University. My research project focuses on rye, and part of the reason why is that I'm originally from Estonia, and rye bread is something that I grew up eating and also baking eventually. Along the way I've learned that indeed there are many pitfalls to rye baking, but I still am of the opinion that it's somewhat simpler to bake with rye, or at least to bake 100% rye sourdough, than it is to bake 100% wheat sourdough, just because there are fewer steps involved. So with a classic wheat sourdough, you need your pre-ferment, and there is mixing involved and a lot of shaping and resting time. Whereas with rye sourdough, it's more of a hands-off process. So there is some mixing, some pre-fermenting, some mixing again, then putting it into the loaf pans, waiting and baking. When my mom first started baking rye sourdough, approximately 10 years ago, I think, then the first results were kind of a failure. So fear not if your first few or first 10 loaves maybe don't come out exactly as anticipated. The other tricky part about the recipe or the rye sourdough making process that I'm going to showcase today is that there aren't really any accurate measurements in there. So just this morning I tried to get some final insights from my mom with regards to the method and the quantities, and her responses were as vague as they could be. So she literally measures nothing, including the salt. So everything goes either by feel or by taste. And even though it's intimidating at the beginning, I do think that it's extremely liberating for home bakers. Because these days when we think about baking, the word science comes to mind, and science is all about precision and measuring everything out and doing it the right way. But this method or non-recipe shows you that you can also achieve nice results without being so stickly or so rigid about the quantities. But now I'll show you how my family makes rye bread and how it's relatively common also to make it in Estonia in general. Making 100% rye sourdough is a 2-day process. So you'd need to start mixing your pre-ferment the night before you intend to bake. In our household, the mixing part was usually done on Saturday evenings after we had had dinner and a nice evening cup of tea. So my mom would put on the kettle and warm up the water a tad. First of all, the liter of water goes into the bowl. So as I said, lukewarm or slightly warmer, because also take into account the fact that your bowl will probably be chillier. And it also depends on the season. So if it's winter time, then the rooms are colder and you need water to be slightly warmer. And then the next thing you need is an active rye sourdough starter. So this is made by mixing rye flour, whole grain rye flour with water. And I've maintained it for quite a while. And I prefer to keep it in a glass jar just because you can see how active it is, how it rises. You can see the bubbles in there that indicate that there is some activity going on. And later we are also going to feed the starter. So my mom tends to use up all the starter that she has. That's again part of the no waste policy. The bakers I've conversed with here claim that that makes the bread too acidic, so it's your call. And I prefer to be somewhere in the middle, so I'm going to add a heaping tablespoon of rye sourdough starter. And you can see how the starter is floating on water, and that means that it's nice and active and bubbly and airy, and it will work great in this recipe. And then I'm going to get my hands in, because I love hand mixing and feeling the dough and feeling the temperature of the ingredients. So I'm going to dissolve the starter in the lukewarm water, and then I'm going to gradually add whole grain rye flour. And the goal here is to make a mix that would be about the thickness of sour cream. So that is the first pre-ferment that we'll later leave to stand overnight. And here, feel free to use a wooden spoon if you'd prefer, because it's not important to get all the lumps of the flour out. They will dissolve into the water overnight anyhow. This is a bit too loose, so I'm going to add in a bit more flour here. And as said, if you don't want to get your hands in the first evening, that's fine. A spoon or even a spatula works just great. So this is about the thickness you're after. And then I'd suggest covering the bowl with a clean towel or a piece of cloth or something. And I remember at our household, when we were making bread during winter time, when it's quite cold in Estonia, then my mom would use sheepskin to cover the bowl just to keep it warmer. And another great idea is just to put it somewhere where it is a tad warmer. So this pre-ferment here has been sitting for already 14 hours, in fact. And you can see that it is slightly bubbly. I would like it to be even more bubbly, but I think my room temperature wasn't quite as high as I thought it would be. And this pre-ferment has also traveled from my home to the lab, so that's why it's not maybe quite the looks that you should be after at home, but we'll see how it turns out. But there's definitely some activity going on. And you can see that the pre-ferment has risen, so it has come up the sides of the bowl and it has fallen again. So that's what you want to see. So that's all good signs. Before I get my hands in the dough, I'm going to butter the loaf tins. So this recipe is good for 2 standard loaf pans. I think mine are slightly smaller, so there might be a bit of a dome appearing, which is fine too. And my mom usually goes for parchment paper, but I find that the parchment paper might stick to the bread and it's hard to get it off the bread. So I always prefer to butter the pans heavily. And I'm going to start by adding salt to the pre-ferment. I weighed this one out, it's 20 grams per 2 loaves. And of course you can adjust it according to your own salt preferences. And my mom said she doesn't even measure the salt anymore, so I think she tastes the dough or just eyeballs it. But volume-wise, just bear in mind that, for instance, this was kosher salt, and it was about 2 tablespoons plus 1 teaspoon. But if you're using sea salt, then that would be a lot less volume-wise, maybe a tablespoon and a half or something along those lines. And I added salt first just to get it really nicely incorporated. Here I'd prefer hand mixing because you want to incorporate some air into the dough. So the salt is now all mixed in, and I'm just going to add flour after that. Some bakers in Estonia like adding some wheat flour to their rye bread, just to give it a better lift. So you get a slightly more open crumb as a result, but I tend to go all rye all the time. In general, I prefer a slightly looser dough, even though it's riskier, and that's because I like when bread is more moist and it also keeps for longer, then it doesn't dry out as quickly as it otherwise would. And an indicator that you've added enough flour, according to my mom, is that the dough becomes hard to mix. So it's you can't do this anymore, but instead you're reverting to, I don't even know how to call it, pushing it with your hand. I don't know what the technical term for it is. All the professional bakers would obviously prefer mixing it with a mixer to also take care of their hands better, because being in acidic or dealing with acidic doughs leads to dry skin eventually, but it all depends on how often you bake. And with wheat flour, one of the indicators that kneading is done is that it doesn't stick to your hands anymore, but this is definitely not the case with rye, because rye tends to be quite sticky still. So there's also this sound. In Estonian they say lurtsuma, so that's kind of the sound effect that you're anticipating. So this lurts, you can hear it maybe. That's what you're after. And I've gone through quite many rye recipes from different regions, and currently the consensus seems to be that longer mixing times are beneficial to the end result. So just take it as a workout for your right arm and keep on kneading until you don't want to do it anymore, and that's the time to divide the dough between the pans. And even though I said that rye remains stubbornly sticky and it adheres to your hands, then I do think we've now reached the point where it's kind of lets go of my fingers and hands, and that's what you're looking for, or that's what you're after. It's a proper workout. I'm earning my rice and beans that we're having for lunch here. And back home, my mom would actually divide this dough into two after mixing. And that's just for having two different kinds of breads. So let's say to one, she would add some ground up coriander. And to other, she would add some diced dried figs and almonds and maybe a touch of cardamom or something like that. And again, she'd never measure anything. So she just eyeballs it. And usually one loaf is slightly bigger than the other one is, but that's totally fine too. Everything gets eaten by the end. And having two different loaves also gives a reason to taste them both just after baking. And recently I came across a video from Germany where the baker was kneading the dough with his feet. So those who prefer a stiffer dough might consider that, although I do not recommend that. So I think we're ready to put the dough into the loaf pans, and we'll see what comes out of it. So you can see it's kind of shaping up. So I'm going to eyeball it too, and just divide it between two loaf pans, and I'll use some water to smooth the tops afterwards. And sometimes in Estonia, if there is an overflow and not everything fits into the pans that you have, then you just use your hands and to shape like little bun-like things that you then bake by the side. And those are kind of a special treat either for the kids or for the baker afterwards. I'd usually go for slightly more than half the pan should be filled with the dough. So this is a touch more. This is maybe like 2/3 already. And we just don't want it out of the pan. And of course you can use a spatula here to aid you. And so I'm just taking some water to smooth the tops. Oh yeah, it still has some space to come up the sides. Yes, I'm slightly pushing it, so you don't want any air in between. But as you were seeing, it was quite cohesive already when I just dumped it into the pan. So now I'm pressing it, and I'm having a bit of water here to smooth the tops. And I'm going to do the same with the other loaf. And as you can see, this one is a touch larger, as it happens when you're eyeballing stuff. But that is just fine too. And of course, you can readjust later, and I could take a smidge of dough and put it into the other pan. But yeah, these are slightly too full. And then what home bakers in Estonia often do is that they again wet their finger, and then they poke 3 holes. Like you press your index finger, it is, right, straight to the bottom. And then you have those holes here. And you want your breads to rise until these holes are filled. So that's an indicator that your bread is ready to go to the oven. And now I'm going to clean my right hand, or right hand. And I'm going to cover these with a cloth and put them into a warm space and clean up all the mess that I've created here. And see you in about 3 to 5 hours once these breads have finished rising. The breads have now been proofing for around 4 hours, and we'll see what they look like beneath the cloth that we placed on them. So as you can see, they have risen quite a bit. They are already well above the line of the tin. So as I was saying, ideally you would have slightly less dough in there, but that's fine too. And the holes that we poked in earlier are almost filled with dough. So that's a great sign, and that's exactly how you want it to be. There's those small bubble-like things that have bursted on top. That's another indication that the bread has come to a full rise. The next step for us now is to put the breads into the oven. So our large deck oven here has been preheating for about an hour. We want it at a relatively high temperature, so it's 500 Fahrenheit to begin with. And you might also want to preheat your home oven for quite a bit, for at least half an hour. And here I'm going to steam the breads. But if your home oven does not have a steaming function, then I suggest just brushing the loaves with some water to add some moisture to them. And some home bakers also have a small dish in the oven with some water, just to make sure that there is enough moisture whilst the breads are baking. But we'll now put these two into the oven. In they go to the center, and I recommend being quite tender with them so that they wouldn't collapse. I'll shut the oven door and start our timed program. You can hear the steam come in, and we'll keep it at 500 Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, and then I'll reduce the oven temperature to 400 Fahrenheit, and we'll go until the end at a lower temperature. And the baking time is a total of an hour usually, but again, it depends. Home ovens sometimes run low, so you might want to bake it for a bit longer, an hour and 15 minutes or so. But that's again something that you kind of need to figure out but on your own through experimentation. So it's time to lower the temperature. We're going from 500 Fahrenheit to 400. And we'll have a quick peek and see how the breads are doing thus far. So, looking nice. They are getting a slightly golden hue there. No collapse is visible, which is great. That's something you don't want. And we'll just hope that everything progresses nicely over the next 50 minutes or so. So the oven here is announcing very vocally that the breads are hopefully ready. I'll turn the oven off, and we'll have a look at those loaves. Oh, I wish I could send the smell to you. It is very, very fragrant. And as you can see, the crust is nicely colored, dark brown. That's exactly what we are looking for. And I'll take the other bread out. And you want to release them from the tins quite soon after you take them out from the oven. That just helps with forming a nicer crust. Otherwise, there is some condensated water that starts appearing, and you get a softer crust. And as you can see, the buttering worked great. The breads are easy to get out from the tins, and the crust also looks great from underneath. And, well, our non-recipe seem to have worked. The truth we will find out tomorrow, because you really want your rye breads to cool down properly. And I must say that I always go against the rule myself, so I lose my patience after a couple of hours because the smell is just so irresistible. But ideally, you'd leave them on the countertop to cool completely. We've used a cooling rack here, again, so that the air can circulate and you don't have water anywhere. That will lead to a crustier crust. So ideally, let them sit here for, I'd say, 6 to 8 hours maybe, and then cut a slice, and that's what we'll be doing in 8 hours too, I suppose. This rye bread here has been standing on the counter overnight, and it has completely cooled down, and it is ready to be cut into, and I must say it still smells absolutely delightful. So we're going to see what came out of it. And I did not wrap it over to keep it overnight. My mom would sometimes use a dish towel or a piece of cloth to wrap around it. Or another key tip is to brush it with butter, or if you have a stick of butter room temperature, then you can just smear some butter on top, and that would give the crust a better sheen, and it also makes it slightly softer if you prefer a softer crust. But this is on the crustier side. So let's cut a slice. So, no flying roof, no loose upper crust, so that's a win-win in my book. And it looks great, so it has got quite a tight crumb, but that's what we're after with this type of bread. And this front part of the bread, also known as the heel of the bread or butt of the bread in different languages, that are the two translations in Estonian. That was always a family treat for us, so we'd smear a generous helping of butter on it and then cut it into 3 pieces because there were 3 family members or 3 members in our family. And I have some nice cultured salted butter. And you can really be generous with the butter because there is no fat in the bread, and rye really has an affinity with butter, as many breads do. And this butter is salted already, so I'm not going to add any sea salt flakes, but otherwise I do love a good sprinkling of salt flakes on top of my buttered bread too. And I'll cut another slice, and I'll put some egg butter on top of that. And that is also kind of an Estonian thing, but also found in other cuisines. And it's very simple to make, so you just hard boil some eggs. Or I'd prefer soft boiled actually, but you can go hard boiled too. So these I boiled for 8 minutes, and you just peel them, mash them, add a generous helping of butter. You could also add mayonnaise if you prefer, and some fresh herbs. Dill would be my herb of choosing, but it's not that easy to come by here. So instead I went for some parsley from my yard. And a bit of salt for seasoning and black pepper if you so desire. And that's it, and it goes wonderfully with rye bread. And in general, anything creamy is excellent on top of this kind of rye sourdough because it is fermented over a long period of time, and that means it's quite sour in taste, and there's also no sugar added. So I'd steer away from anything very acidic or like fresher cheeses maybe. And my one of my favorite treats as a kid was sourdough rye, butter, and a drizzle of honey on top. That's also excellent. So I hope you'll enjoy. I think they look very nice.
Are you surprised?
I mean, there's always this slight concern because it's not my mom baking. And I haven't baked with her in such a long time. So the element of surprise and working side to side with professional bakers, I think that has had a negative impact on my faith in my baking skills. But these smell wonderful, and I hope they will taste great too.